The biscuit tin was empty. Pauline Monroe stood at the long supper table in the flickering lamplight, staring at the empty spot where the last biscuit had been, and she felt the world tilt sideways beneath her boots. Not because she was hungry, though God knew she had been hungry plenty of times since arriving at the Wilcox cattle operation 6 weeks ago. Not because the men around her were laughing and shoving and reaching across one another with calloused hands and zero manners. No. The world tilted because Wallace Wilcox, the most closed-off, hardest-jawed cattleman in the San Antonio River Valley, was looking at her from across the table with an expression she had never seen on his face before. An expression that cracked something open in her chest and left her standing there, breathless, holding a tin plate she had forgotten she was holding. He had done it again. He had slid that last biscuit onto her plate before she even reached the table. Set it there without announcement, without ceremony, without so much as a glance in her direction that anyone else would have caught. 6 weeks of suppers. 6 weeks of that last biscuit appearing on her plate like a quiet, stubborn, forbidden secret that neither of them had the courage to speak aloud. And tonight, Hector Brannigan had seen it. Hector Brannigan, who was big and mean, and who had been trying to run Pauline off the Wilcox spread since the afternoon she arrived, pulled himself to his full height at the far end of the table and let out a slow, ugly laugh. The kind of laugh that silenced every other man in the room. The kind of laugh that was not really a laugh at all, but a trap snapping shut. "Well now," Hector said, and his voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a very long time for a particular moment. "That explains a whole lot of things about this operation." Wallace did not look at Hector. He looked at Pauline, and in that single second of locked eyes, Pauline understood that everything was about to change. That whatever careful, silent, unspoken thing had been building between them over 6 weeks of suppers and early mornings, and the vast, star-covered Texas sky was about to be dragged out into the open air and held up to the kind of scrutiny that could destroy it before it had ever truly lived. "You got something to say, Brannigan?" Wallace's voice was even, dangerously, carefully even. "I got plenty to say," Hector replied, "starting with the fact that a cook has no business being handled like she's the cattleman's personal concern." The word cook landed in the room like a slap, deliberate and sharp, because Pauline was not the cook. She was the new ranch bookkeeper, and every man at that table knew it. And every man at that table also knew that Hector Brannigan had been calling her the cook since the day she arrived, because he could not stand the idea of a woman holding authority over any numbers that affected his wages. Pauline set her plate down on the table with a sound that was quieter than she intended. She lifted her chin, and she looked directly at Wallace Wilcox, who was already standing up. 6 weeks earlier, Pauline Monroe had stepped off the southbound stage in Caldwell County, Texas, in the first week of April, 1878, with a carpet bag, a leather-bound ledger, a letter of employment, and absolutely no illusions about what she was walking into. She was 26 years old, which meant she was old enough to know that the world had opinions about women who traveled alone and accepted employment in male-dominated industries, and young enough to still believe that being right was sufficient armor against those opinions. She had been wrong about that before. She would likely be wrong about it again. She had accepted this. The letter of employment had come through a professional agency in San Antonio that matched trained bookkeepers with ranch operations throughout southern Texas. Pauline had trained for 2 years under a meticulous and demanding accountant named Herbert Crow in San Antonio before his retirement, and she had spent the 3 years since managing the books for a mid-sized cattle broker on the east side of the city. She was, by any professional measurement, more than qualified for the position at the Wilcox Cattle Company. What the agency letter had not prepared her for was Wallace Wilcox himself. She had formed certain expectations based on the tone of the correspondence. The letters from the Wilcox operation regarding the position had been brief, precise, and entirely without ornament. Terms, duties, compensation, start date. She had assumed reasonably that the man behind those letters would be elderly, economical in all things, perhaps a little cold, perhaps a great deal cold. The man who met her stage was not elderly. He was somewhere in his early 30s, though the sun and the work had made him difficult to age precisely. He was tall and broad through the shoulder in the way that men got when they had spent their entire lives doing physical labor, not the kind of broad that came from leisure or excess. His hair was dark and cut short in a practical way that had nothing to do with style. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that was almost amber in direct sunlight, and they assessed her with the same brevity and precision as his correspondence. No warmth, no hostility, pure assessment. "Miss Monroe," he said, and confirmed his identity without any surplus words at all. "Mr. Wilcox," she replied, and she did not offer her hand because she had the strong sense he was not the kind of man who offered his. He took her carpet bag from her before she could protest, not with any particular tenderness but with the absolute efficiency of a man who was already moving forward to the next necessary task. He placed it in the back of a flatbed wagon without ceremony. He climbed to the driver's seat. He waited. Pauline climbed up beside him, and they drove the 11 miles to the Wilcox Cattle Company in almost total silence, and she watched the Texas brush country roll past around her, all mesquite and prickly pear and the achingly wide blue sky, and she thought, "This is a man carrying something heavy." She could not have explained how she knew that. She just knew it the way you knew a storm was coming before the clouds had fully gathered. The ranch itself spread across a significant portion of the valley. She would learn in the following weeks just how significant. Wallace Wilcox ran approximately 3,000 head of longhorn cattle with a crew of 14 men, maintained 2 separate line camps on the outer boundaries of his land, and conducted business with brokers as far north as Abilene and as far south as the Gulf Coast. The operation was large enough and complex enough that the financial records had become genuinely unmanageable for a man who was also running day-to-day operations. And the previous bookkeeper, an older man named Greer, had retired to live with his daughter in Houston the previous winter. Pauline was shown to a small room at the back of the main house, separate from the bunkhouse where the crew slept, which was both practical and appropriate, and which Wallace had arranged with a straightforward attention to her situation that she appreciated. The room had a window that faced east, a solid pine desk, a lamp, and a cot. It was clean. It was private. It was more than she had expected. The financial records, on the other hand, were a catastrophe. She spent the first 3 days simply organizing. Greer had been a decent enough accountant in his prime, but had clearly been declining for the last 2 years of his tenure, and the records reflected that decline in a way that made Pauline's eye twitch. Cattle sales recorded without corresponding expense entries. Supply purchases logged in 3 different places with inconsistent descriptions. Wages that did not reconcile against the crew roster she found tacked to the inside of the supply cabinet. She worked from before dawn until well after dark those first 3 days, eating irregularly, sleeping less than she should, building the comprehensive picture she needed before she could begin to bring the records into order. It was on the 4th day, at the first crew supper she attended, that she met Hector Brannigan. The crew ate together every evening at a long table in the room adjacent to the kitchen, which the hands called the mess room. It was a practical arrangement. Wallace's cook, a compact and eternally efficient Mexican man named Domingo who had been with the operation for 12 years, produced food in quantities suited to working men with enormous appetites, and it was served at the table family style, which meant that the hands passed dishes around and helped themselves, and the general rule was that the fastest and most aggressive arm prevailed. Pauline arrived at supper that first evening slightly late because she had been finishing a reconciliation and had lost track of the time. By the time she got to the table, several of the hands were already seated, and Domingo was bringing out the last of the food. There was a place set for her at the far end of the table, the slightly quieter end, which she suspected Wallace had arranged, though he had not said so. Hector Brannigan was already seated and already eating, and he looked up when she came in with the specific expression of a man who had formed his conclusion before she walked through the door and intended to maintain it regardless of evidence. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, heavy-set and weathered, with a thick reddish mustache and the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of working in bright sun. He had been with the Wilcox operation for 9 years. She would learn. He considered himself the second in command. "Bookkeeper," he said, the word delivered like a category rather than a greeting. "Good evening," Pauline replied and sat down. The conversation around the table was the kind of loud, overlapping, ranching-focused conversation she had expected. Cattle talk, weather talk, equipment complaints. She ate and listened and said very little, which was her habit in new situations. She was learning the landscape. What she noticed, though it did not fully register until it happened again the next evening and then the evening after that, was the biscuits. Domingo made biscuits every evening. He made them in a large cast iron pan, and he made exactly as many as would fit in that pan, which was a consistent number. And by the time the dish reached the end of the table, it usually contained 1 biscuit, sometimes none. On the 4th day, Pauline arrived at supper on time and took her seat and watched the dish of biscuits make its way down the table, each man taking 1 or sometimes 2, the pile diminishing with reliable speed. When the dish arrived in front of the man 2 seats up from her, there was 1 biscuit left. He reached for it, and then there was a small, almost imperceptible pause, and then he passed the dish along without taking it. The dish arrived in front of Pauline with 1 biscuit in it. She took it. She did not think much of it. She thanked the man who had passed it, and he shrugged in the unself-conscious way of someone doing something unremarkable, and supper continued. But on the 5th day it happened again. The dish arrived with 1 biscuit. The man just above her in the passing order declined it and passed it along, a different man than the day before. On the 6th day, she watched more carefully. The dish started from Wallace's end of the table. He took 1 biscuit, the same as the other men, and passed it along. By the time it reached the midpoint of the table, there were 3 biscuits left. By the time it reached the last 3 men before her, there was 1. The second-to-last man glanced at it, glanced briefly down the table in her direction, and passed the dish. She looked up at Wallace. He was not looking at her. He was talking to the man on his left about a fence line that needed attention on the north boundary. His face was entirely neutral. He appeared to have zero awareness of the biscuit situation whatsoever. But Pauline was a bookkeeper. She paid attention to patterns. And the pattern was becoming undeniable. Somehow, through some mechanism she could not quite observe directly, the last biscuit arrived on her plate every single evening. She mentioned it to Domingo one morning when she was getting coffee before the hands were up. She asked if he was setting one aside for her specifically. Domingo looked at her with the mild patience of a man who understood a great many things he did not discuss. "I make as many as fit in the pan, Miss Monroe," he said. "Same as always." She watched more carefully over the following week. She watched the order in which men took their biscuits. She watched which men hesitated. She tried to identify any coordination or conversation she might be missing. She could not find the mechanism, but the last biscuit always arrived on her plate. And somehow, without any evidence she could have defended in court, she was increasingly certain that the mechanism had its origin at Wallace Wilcox's end of the table. The work of the bookkeeping moved forward. By the end of the 3rd week, Pauline had the records organized into a coherent system and had begun the work of reconciliation. This was where it got complicated, because as she pulled the financial picture into clarity, certain things emerged that were uncomfortable. There were discrepancies in the supply accounts, not large ones but consistent ones. Purchases recorded at slightly higher amounts than the corresponding invoices supported. The difference was not enormous, but it was systematic, and systematic small discrepancies were more troubling than large erratic ones, because they indicated intention rather than error. She worked carefully, cross-referencing over 14 months of records before she was certain enough to bring it forward. Then she requested a meeting with Wallace. He received her in what served as his office, a room off the main hallway of the house furnished with the same absolute functionality as everything else about the operation. A large desk, a map of the county on the wall with the property boundaries marked, 2 chairs. He sat in one and she sat in the other, and she opened the ledger she had brought and walked him through what she had found, column by column, entry by entry, with the methodical precision she brought to everything. He listened without interrupting. His expression did not change much, but she had been watching his face for 3 weeks by then, and she was beginning to learn the small shifts, the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was processing something he did not like, the way his jaw settled when he made a decision. When she finished, he said, "How much total?" She told him. It was not a ruinous sum, but it was not nothing. "Who?" he said. She had hesitated on this. She did not have direct proof tied to a single individual. She had a pattern that pointed strongly in one direction. She said so. He looked at the column of figures she had laid out and said, "Brannigan handles supply orders." "Yes," she said. There was a silence that lasted long enough for the afternoon light to shift slightly through the window. "You are confident in the figures," he said. "I am confident in the figures," she said. He nodded once. It was not a dismissal. It was, she was beginning to understand, the way he indicated that he had received a piece of information completely and would now act on it in the way he thought best. "Thank you, Miss Monroe," he said. She gathered her ledger and left the office, and she was almost certain she felt his eyes on her back as she walked down the hallway, though when she glanced over her shoulder, he was looking at the map. What followed was a period of about 2 weeks during which nothing obviously happened, but she could feel things shifting beneath the surface of the operation, the way fault lines shifted beneath the ground. Wallace moved quietly. He did not confront Brannigan directly or immediately. He began cross-referencing supply deliveries against records himself, which she knew because he asked her for the invoices she had been comparing, and she provided them with detailed annotations. He spoke with the ranch hand who had made several of the supply runs, a quiet young man named Cole Jeffers, without Brannigan present. Brannigan, meanwhile, became increasingly hostile toward Pauline, not overtly, not in ways she could point to and name in front of witnesses, but in the accumulation of small, grinding things, the way he never used her name or her title, referring to her as the bookkeeper or, with particular pointed dismissal, the cook. The way he positioned himself in conversations to talk across her, as though she were not present. The way he found reasons to linger in the doorway of the room where she worked, not speaking, just standing there with a particular quality of attention that was designed to unsettle. She did not tell Wallace about this. She handled it herself, which was what she did with things. She was from a family of modest means in Biscuit County who had taught her, largely through example, that you managed what you could manage with the resources you had, and you did not complain about the things that were simply part of the landscape. Being dismissed by men was part of the landscape. She navigated it. But she was aware, in a way she was careful not to examine too closely, that the awareness she had of Wallace's position relative to hers was growing in a direction she had not planned for. She noticed him the way she noticed the biscuit, in the accumulation of small, consistent things that formed a pattern she could not explain away. He rose before the rest of the operation every morning without exception. She knew this because she herself rose early, had her whole life, and she would sometimes hear the soft sounds of him moving through the house before the first gray of dawn appeared at her window. He did not start loud or demanding. He started quiet, which she found unusual and oddly reassuring. He was fair with the men in a way that was not soft. He held high expectations without cruelty, which she recognized as a genuinely rare combination. She had worked for people on both ends of the spectrum and far fewer in the middle. When he was dissatisfied with work, he said so directly and once, without lingering over it. When work was done well, he acknowledged it with similar brevity. The hands respected him with the specific quality of respect that was not fear-based, which was also, she was coming to understand, a genuinely rare thing. He sometimes stopped in the doorway of the room where she worked in the evenings. Not the way Brannigan lingered, with that heavy, pressing quality. He would stop, glance in, assess that she was there and working, occasionally say something brief about an upcoming expense or a delivery she should know about, and move on. These exchanges lasted rarely more than 30 seconds. She found herself listening for his step in the hallway. She told herself this was because she was genuinely interested in the financial picture of the operation, which was the most complex and interesting work she had done in her professional life, and understanding the operational context required awareness of the man running the operation. This was true. It was also not the complete truth, and she was a woman who valued accuracy. The biscuits continued, every supper without fail. The last biscuit arrived on her plate by some mechanism she had still not fully mapped, and Wallace Wilcox never once glanced at her in a way that connected him to it, and the entire thing had taken on the quality of a secret she was keeping with someone who had never spoken a word of it to her. It was in the 5th week that the situation with Brannigan escalated to the point that it could no longer be navigated quietly. Pauline had completed the full reconciliation of the previous year's accounts and had drafted a detailed report for Wallace's review, including her findings regarding the supply discrepancies and a conservative estimate of the total amount over a period she could document with confidence. She had left this report on Wallace's desk on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Brannigan knew she had done it. She did not know how he knew. The operation was not large enough for secrets to move slowly. She was in the supply room doing an inventory count against the records when she heard his boots on the floor behind her, and turned to find him blocking the doorway with his arms crossed and that particular quality of stillness that meant he had made a decision. "You got a problem keeping to your own business," he said. Pauline set down her inventory sheet. "My business," she said, "is the accurate management of the financial records of this operation. That is specifically what I was employed to do." "You were employed to keep books, not to go digging through a man's professional history looking for things to report." "I was employed to keep accurate books," she said, "which requires identifying and correcting inaccuracies wherever they exist." The silence that followed was the wrong kind of silence, the kind with too much pressure in it. "A woman like you," Hector said, with a particular deliberateness, "in a place like this, working for a man like Wilcox, would do well to understand how quickly a comfortable situation can become an uncomfortable one." It was a threat. Not subtle enough to claim otherwise, but oblique enough to deny. Pauline held his gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her inventory sheet and her pencil and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Brannigan," and continued counting. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he left. She finished the inventory with hands that were perfectly steady. That evening she wrote down the exact words of the exchange in a small notebook she kept in her room, because she was a bookkeeper and she understood the importance of documentation. She did not go to Wallace. Not yet. She wanted to see what he would do with the report. She got her answer at supper that evening, which was when Wallace said, in his brief, even way, to the table at large that he wanted the supply run process documented going forward, with all invoices signed by both the purchasing hand and the receiving hand before entries were made in the records. He said this as a statement of new procedure without looking at Brannigan, without any identifiable emotion, and then he passed the bread basket. Several of the hands glanced at Brannigan. Brannigan's expression was the controlled, compressed expression of a man containing something large. Pauline ate her supper, and on the biscuit dish, at the end of its journey down the long table, there was one biscuit left. She took it. She ate it. She did not look at Wallace. But something in the room had shifted, and she was increasingly unable to pretend otherwise. The confrontation that had begun at the supper table, the one that had knocked the world sideways on its axis, had been building to that moment for 6 weeks, and it arrived with the brutal efficiency of a thing that had been waiting for its opening. Hector Brannigan stood at the far end of the table with that ugly laugh still echoing in the mess room and said, "That explains a whole lot of things about this operation." And Wallace had risen from his chair with a quality of calm that was somehow more dangerous than visible anger. "If you have a specific concern about how this operation is being run," Wallace said, "you are welcome to bring it to me directly, and I will give it appropriate consideration. What you will not do is make a spectacle at my table about things that are not your business." "She's not your business," Hector said, and she was delivered with the specific contempt of a man who had decided that contempt was all he had left. "She's been in your books and in your head since she got here, and every man at this table has noticed, and it makes you look soft, and it makes this whole operation look sideways, and I'm telling you that plain because someone has to." The mess room was completely silent. 14 men who generally produced a continuous volume of conversation sat absolutely still. Pauline was aware of two distinct things simultaneously. The first was that she was furious. In the clean, hard way she got furious when someone tried to use her as a weapon against herself, tried to make her presence the problem rather than the actual problem. The second was that her heart was pounding at a rate she found physiologically inconvenient, because Wallace Wilcox was standing at the other end of that table, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, something that cracked through all the careful management he maintained over his expressions. And what she saw there was not just anger. What she saw there was something that made the 6 weeks of Biscuit suddenly and completely legible. "What you are doing," Wallace said to Brannigan, his voice so controlled it was almost quiet, "is attempting to make a professional situation into a personal accusation, because you are sitting in this room with clear knowledge of your own conduct, and you are trying to make someone else's presence the issue. Miss Monroe is the bookkeeper of this operation. She has done her job with more precision and competence than any person I have employed in that capacity. Whatever you imagine about anything else is a product of your imagination and your agenda, and neither is welcome at my table." Hector Brannigan stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Pauline with an expression that she filed away carefully in the part of her mind that kept documentation. Then he pushed his chair back from the table, stood up, and walked out of the mess room. The door did not slam. That was almost worse than if it had. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds before it was broken by Cole Jeffers, the young hand who had been involved in the supply run investigation, who said quietly, "Biscuits are getting cold," and reached for the bread basket, and in the way that men sometimes broke tension with the simplest possible gesture, the table slowly came back to life around them. Pauline sat down. She realized she had been standing. She picked up her fork. Her plate was in front of her, and on it, in the place it had occupied every evening for 6 weeks, was the last biscuit. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up the length of the table, and Wallace was looking directly at her, and for the first time in 6 weeks he did not immediately look away. He held her gaze for a full, measured, considerable moment. Then he sat back down and picked up his coffee, and the supper continued. The following morning was a Saturday, which meant the general schedule of the operation was slightly looser, with smaller crews needed for the immediate work and a general atmosphere of slightly less urgency than weekdays carried. Pauline used Saturdays to work on longer-term projects in the accounts, the kind of analysis that required unbroken concentration and which was difficult to achieve during the more active days of the week. She was at her desk before 8 in the morning when she heard the knock at the open door of her workroom and looked up to find Wallace standing in it. This was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was that he was not carrying anything, not on his way through to somewhere else, and he had none of the purposeful transitional quality he normally had when he stopped in her doorway. He was simply standing there. "Mr. Wilcox," she said. "Miss Monroe," he said. A pause. "Last evening," he said, and then stopped, which was highly unusual because he was not a man who started sentences he did not finish. Pauline set down her pencil. She gave him her full attention. He came into the room and stood near the window, not sitting, which seemed like a decision about maintaining a certain manageable distance. He looked out the window for a moment, then back at her. "Brannigan came to me this morning," he said. "He has removed himself from the operation. His wages have been settled." She absorbed this. "I see," she said. "It was a conversation that has been coming for some time," he said. "The matters you brought to my attention in the accounts were part of it. His conduct last evening was the remainder." A pause. "I want to be certain you know that his removal had nothing to do with anything he said about you and everything to do with his own actions." "I understood that," she said, which was true. He nodded. He looked at the window again. There was a quality to the silence that she recognized from certain entries in the ledger, the ones that represented something real and significant that had not yet been properly accounted for. "The biscuits," she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it because she had not planned to. He turned from the window and looked at her. 6 weeks, she said, keeping her voice as neutral as she was able. "Every supper, the last biscuit." The expression on his face was the most open expression she had ever seen there. It was not comfortable for him. She could see that clearly. He was a man who had built a very functional life around managing his own interior carefully, and she was standing outside that management asking for admission, and she was not entirely sure she had the right. "It was not nothing," she said. "I am a bookkeeper. I notice patterns, and I know it was not nothing." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to retreat into the territory of brevity and function, and she was going to have to find a way to make peace with having said that out loud and been answered with silence. Then he said, "No, it was not nothing." The words were quiet and simple, and they landed in the room with enormous weight. Pauline sat with that for a moment. "Why did you never say anything?" she asked. He moved from the window and sat down in the chair across from her desk, the same chair he had sat in when she had walked him through the discrepancy report, and he folded his hands together in the particular way he had when he was thinking. "Because you came here to work," he said. "Because saying something and being wrong about it would have made your position here untenable. Because saying something and being right about it would have complicated your position here in a different way. Because I did not think I had the right to say anything until I understood more clearly what I was trying to say." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Now I understand more clearly." Something had shifted in the air of the small room, the way air shifted before a storm, charged and expectant. Pauline was aware that she was in professional territory she had never navigated, that she was the employee and he was the employer, and that the rules of 1878 in Caldwell County, Texas, had very specific things to say about women who allowed those lines to blur. She was also aware that the rules of 1878 in Caldwell County, Texas, had very specific things to say about a great many things she had already declined to honor. "I need to tell you something about myself," she said, which was not the direction she had expected the conversation to go, but felt suddenly necessary. "I took this position because I am good at the work, and because the terms were favorable, but also because I left a situation in San Antonio that was not workable, and I needed to be somewhere that my work could stand on its own merits without being filtered through the opinions of people who had already decided what I was." He was listening with the absolute attention he brought to everything, the kind of attention that made you feel like the most important information in the room. "I am telling you this," she continued, "because I want you to know that I have not been unaware of you, that I have noticed things, that the biscuits were not lost on me, but that I have also been very carefully not letting myself consider it because I came here to work and I did not want to complicate that. And I have a history of very carefully managing the things I do not want to consider, and I am not entirely certain that history is serving me as well as it once did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You lost someone," he said, and it was not a question. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon. In San Antonio, the situation that was not workable, there was someone." She was briefly unsettled by the accuracy of this. "There was," she said carefully, "a man I worked for who had initially been straightforward about his professional intentions toward me and then had not been, and who used his position to make things difficult when I declined his other intentions. It ended my employment there, which is why I came through the agency." His jaw had tightened in the way it tightened when he made a decision. "His name," he said. "I'm not going to give you his name," she said. "No," he agreed, and she had the sense he recognized he did not have the right to that particular information in the context of what they were currently being to one another. "I'm sorry that happened." The directness of it was startling, not performance, not positioning, just a simple statement of regret for a wrong done to her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It was the kind of silence that meant something was being established rather than avoided. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Pauline." The use of her given name was deliberate and careful, a question embedded in a statement. "I would like to be honest with you about something." "Please," she said. He looked at his folded hands for a moment, then back at her. "I have been running this operation for 11 years. I built it from 40 head and a lease on a piece of ground that nobody else wanted. I have been very focused on the work, which has been intentional, because there were years when the work was all there was and it had to be enough. I am not practiced at this." A pause. "I do not say that as an excuse. I say it because I think you should understand that when I am not saying things, it is not because I do not have them to say. It is because the space between having something to say and saying it has been very wide in my life, and I have not found many reasons to cross it." Pauline looked at him for a long moment, this contained, careful man who had managed her care through the mechanism of Biscuits for 6 weeks, because it was the only form he could find that felt safe, and she felt something in her chest do something she had not felt it do in a very long time. "That is the most I have heard you say at one time," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest to a smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face in a way she found completely unfair. "It is the most I have said at one time in a considerable period," he confirmed. "I appreciate it," she said. "Do you?" he asked. "Very much." He looked at her, and the amber brown of his eyes in the morning light from the east window was doing things she was going to have to address at some later point when she had more available internal resources. "Then I would like to ask," he said, "whether you would be willing to take supper with me this evening. Not in the mess room, here. I thought Domingo could manage something at the table in the main dining room." A pause. "If you are comfortable with that." She held his gaze. "I am comfortable with that," she said. He nodded with the particular efficiency of a man who had gotten the answer he needed and was now moving to the next task. He stood up. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped in the doorway and turned back, and there was a brief, unguarded quality to his expression that she did not think he intended to show but which appeared anyway. "For what it is worth," he said, "there was no particular mechanism to the Biscuits. I did not coordinate it. I simply indicated at the start of each week to the men that if there was one left when the dish reached the end of the table, it should be passed to you. Most of them did as asked without question. Cole Jeffers was particularly reliable about it." She stared at him. "You told them to." "I suggested it," he said, with the very slight distinction of a man who was being precise. "You were working very long hours at the time, and you were not always eating regular meals, and the biscuits were substantial, and I thought it was practical." "You thought it was practical," she repeated. "I also thought," he said quietly, "that it was the only thing I felt I had the standing to do, at the time." He held her gaze for one more moment, and then he was gone from the doorway, and she could hear his boot steps retreating down the hallway with the same unhurried certainty they always had. Pauline sat very still at her desk for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil, looked at the columns of figures in front of her, and discovered that she had absolutely no concentration available. She smiled at the ledger page, which she could not have helped if she had tried, and then she picked up her pencil and got to work. Supper that evening was a revelation of a particular kind. Domingo had, with the quiet competence of a man who understood the situation fully without being told anything about it, prepared a meal that was considerably more composed than the usual crew fare. There was a roasted chicken. There were proper vegetables, and not just the stewed beans of the mess table. There was cornbread made in individual portions. There were 2 chairs set at the end of the main dining table, which was a table built for a much larger gathering than 2, so that the intimacy of the setting was real, but the scale of it was not intimidating. Pauline wore a dress rather than her working clothes, which was a decision she had made and then reconsidered, and then made again. It was a dark blue wool dress she had worn to church in San Antonio, and which she had brought more out of habit than expectation. She felt slightly unlike herself in it, which she then recognized as the sensation of being seen differently than usual, and which she then recognized as something she was not entirely opposed to. Wallace had washed up and changed his shirt, which on him represented the same level of effort as the dress had represented for her, and it struck her that they were both people who expressed care through specific and manageable gestures rather than elaborate productions. They sat across from one another, and Domingo appeared and disappeared with remarkable tact, and they talked in a way that was different from any exchange they had had in the 6 weeks prior. Not about the accounts, not about the operation. They talked the way people talked when they were trying to understand the full shape of someone, the history and texture that made them what they were. He had grown up in Gonzales County, he told her. The youngest of 3 brothers, the other 2 of whom had moved west to New Mexico in recent years. His father had been a cattleman and his grandfather before that, and he had grown up understanding that the land and the cattle were inseparable from identity in a way that was not simply sentimental but structural. He had loved it and been frustrated by it in equal measure. He had wanted to see more of the world at various points in his youth and had instead stayed close and built something, and he had made peace with that choice in the way you made peace with choices that had required sacrifice. "Did you ever want to leave?" she asked. He considered this. "There was a period," he said, "when I thought about it seriously, when I was about 20 and the operation was still small enough that I could have walked away from it without feeling I was abandoning something important. I had an opportunity to go north with a trail drive that was going all the way to Montana, and the man running it needed experienced hands." He paused. "I did not go. My father was not well that year and I stayed to run things." By the time he recovered, the operation had grown enough that leaving felt different. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "No," he said, simply and immediately. "I would regret it if I had gone. But there are things I never did because I stayed, and occasionally I am aware of that." She told him about Biscuit County, about a childhood that was not unhappy but was tightly stretched financially, with a father who worked for a freight company and a mother who took in sewing, and 2 younger sisters who Pauline had taken a largely maternal role with from a young age. About the sense she had developed early that precise knowledge of where things stood financially was the only reliable protection against the kind of uncertainty her family had lived with, and how that sense had shaped her into exactly the kind of person who kept meticulous records of everything. She told him about the decision to train as a bookkeeper, which had met with her father's full support and her mother's slightly more qualified support, the qualification being that it was an unusual path for a woman, not that it was wrong. "She was not wrong," Pauline said. "It is an unusual path, but I was better suited for unusual than for the available alternatives." Wallace looked at her with that direct, steady look he had, the one that did not perform interest but simply had it. "I am glad you took it," he said. It was not a complicated thing to say, but it was said with such straightforward sincerity that she felt it land somewhere important. "So am I," she said. They talked long after the food was finished, and Domingo appeared at one point to take the dishes away and refill the coffee, and disappeared again, with the efficiency of a man who had decided his work was done, and the rest was none of his concern. And the evening darkened outside the windows of the dining room, and the lamp on the table burned steadily, and the night pressed warm and full of insects against the glass. At a certain point, Pauline became aware that they had been talking for nearly 3 hours, which was longer than she had ever talked to anyone in what she would have classified as a single conversation. And she also became aware that she was happy in a way that had a specific, located quality to it. Tied to this room, and this table and this man across from her, who had moved from contained and precise to something that still maintained those qualities, but that had also opened to include warmth and humor, and a specific attention that she felt like sunlight. He walked her back to the door of her room, which was a 15-second walk down a hallway, and they stood at the door for a moment in the way of people who had arrived somewhere and were not yet entirely ready to leave it. "Thank you," she said, "for this evening." "Thank you for agreeing to it," he said, a pause that was not uncomfortable. "I should also thank you for the biscuits," she said, and watched his face do that thing with the corner of his mouth. "Even if you're going to call it practical." "It was practical," he maintained. "It was also kind," she said, "and I know you know that." He held her gaze for a moment. "Good night, Miss Monroe," he said. "Good night, Mr. Wilcox," she said. She went into her room and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the wall for a while and felt the full, flooding warmth of something beginning in the exact opposite way things that ended badly usually began. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Something had been named, even in the oblique and careful way they had named it, and naming it changed the shape of everything. They continued to have occasional suppers together in the dining room, roughly once a week, which was frequent enough to be meaningful and infrequent enough to maintain the kind of careful dignity they were both inclined to. The conversations ranged further as the weeks passed. She told him about her friend in San Antonio, a woman named Cecilia who had been her closest companion for years before Cecilia married and moved to Houston. He told her about a period in his 20s when he had been briefly and disastrously involved with a woman whose family had expected a level of social performance from him that he was fundamentally incapable of providing. "What happened?" she asked. "She married someone else," he said. "I believe everyone was better served by that outcome, including her." There was no visible grief in this, just the matter-of-fact recognition of an incompatibility that had resolved itself appropriately, but she heard beneath it the particular kind of loneliness that came from feeling unsuited to the version of human connection that was generally on offer. "You are not as unsuited as you think," she said, "to connection. You are particular about it, which is different." He looked at her. "How do you know what I think about it?" "Because I notice things," she said. "I told you from the beginning I notice patterns." He was quiet for a moment. "What pattern are you noticing?" he asked, and there was something under the question that was not entirely neutral. She met his eyes. A man who expresses care through consistent, reliable, practical gestures rather than declarations. A man who shows up in the same place at the same time every morning because the people who depend on him need to be able to count on that. A man who makes sure someone is fed without making it a performance. That pattern. The silence that followed was charged. "Pauline," he said, and the use of her name without preamble had become something she looked forward to without quite admitting it. "Yes," she said, "I would like to continue in this direction," he said. "Whatever this is, I would like to continue." "So would I," she said. By midsummer, the direction had a name, though they had not yet used the word. They had used other words and other gestures, the gradual accumulation of which told the same story without requiring the single definitive statement that both of them were, each in their own way, slightly afraid to make. He had begun to find reasons to be in the vicinity of where she was working that were not entirely required by operational necessity. She had begun to ask questions about the cattle business that were not strictly required by her bookkeeping function, because she was genuinely interested, and because being interested in his world was a way of being interested in him that was available to her. She had met his two older brothers on a Sunday afternoon in late June when they made a rare joint visit to the ranch, and the dynamic of the three Wilcox men had told her a great deal she had not previously known. The older brothers, James and Thomas, were bigger personalities, louder and more expansive, and Wallace was quieter in their presence in a way that was not suppressed, but was simply the natural calibration of a man who did not need to fill all the available air. She saw how they looked at him, the specific combination of respect and something that was almost protective, and she understood that the youngest of three brothers who had stayed when others left had occupied a particular role in that family, the reliable one, the constant one, and that this had shaped him in ways that were both beautiful and difficult. She was helping Domingo organize the kitchen stores one afternoon in July when James Wilcox, who was extending his visit by a few days, appeared in the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame with the posture of a man who had a question he was working up to. "You are considerably more than a bookkeeper," he said, in a tone that was not unkind but was assessing. "I am precisely a bookkeeper," she said, without looking up from the inventory. "A very good one." "Wallace thinks so," James said. She looked up. James Wilcox had the same amber-brown eyes as his brother, though with more expressiveness in them, less managed. "Does he?" she said. "He thinks a great deal about a number of things where you're concerned," James said. "He won't say so directly because he is Wallace, but I have known him for 33 years and I can read the man." A pause. "I just want you to know that whatever he has or has not said, the measure of it is in how he acts. Always has been." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. James looked at her for a moment, then pushed off the doorframe with a nod. "Good," he said, and left. The summer moved through itself with the particular quality of a thing that is getting ready to become something else. The ranch work had its rhythms, the gathering and movement of cattle, the maintenance of fences and equipment, the management of water in a landscape where water was always and forever a concern. Pauline worked through the second half of the financial year with a thoroughness that produced the cleanest set of accounts the operation had likely seen in years, and the satisfaction of this was real and separate from everything else, the simple satisfaction of work done well. But everything else was not separate from the satisfaction of work. It had woven itself into the same fabric, the way the biscuits had been simultaneously practical and something more, and Pauline found herself arriving at each day with a fullness she recognized as happiness, properly and specifically located. In the third week of August, on a Tuesday evening after the crew had finished supper and drifted back toward the bunkhouse and Domingo had cleared the mess table and gone to his own quarters, Pauline was walking from the mess room back toward the main house when Wallace fell into step beside her. This was not unusual. The evening walk from supper to the house was a natural route for both of them. What was unusual was that he stopped before they reached the door. They were standing in the yard between the mess building and the main house, in the warm darkness of a Texas August night, with the sky above them absolutely saturated with stars in the way the sky got out here away from any city, and the cattle sounds drifting from the distant corrals, and the particular smell of the night that was grass and dust, and the faint sweetness of something she had never been able to identify, but had come to think of as the smell of this place specifically. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was constructing something carefully. "I have had most of my life ordered around a clear set of priorities," he said. "The land, the operation, the people who depend on it working well. Those priorities have not changed and will not change. I am telling you this not because it is a warning but because it is the truth of who I am, and I think you deserve the full truth before I say what I want to say." She waited. "I also think," he said, "that you are the most intelligent and capable and honest person I have had in my life in a very long time, and that the last 4 months have been different from the period before them in ways that I notice every day, and that when I imagine the structure of my life going forward, I cannot construct a version of it that makes sense to me without you in it, not as an employee, as something more important." The stars were very bright. The cattle were very quiet. The night felt very large. "Wallace," she said, "I know that my manner of expressing this is not conventional," he said. "I don't want conventional," she said. "I have never wanted conventional." He turned to look at her fully. "I am asking whether you would consider being my wife," he said. "I am asking it directly because I think you prefer that, and because I have been working up to it since approximately the 3rd week of your arrival, and I think 6 weeks is long enough to manage something that should have been said before now." She looked at him in the starlight, this careful, steady, remarkable man who had kept her fed through the mechanism of biscuits and had removed a threat to her safety, and had told her more of his internal landscape in the past few months than she suspected he had told most people in his entire life, and who was now standing in the dark in his yard asking her to stay. "Yes," she said, "I would very much like to be your wife." The silence that followed was the kind that was not empty but completely full. He reached out and took her hand, which was a gesture of such simple and direct intimacy from a man of his particular reserve that she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and he held her hand with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and they stood there in the Texas night for a long, uncounted moment. Then he said, "I am also not entirely certain how to conduct the portion of this that comes between asking and the other thing." She laughed, which surprised both of them, a genuine full laugh that went up into the night air. "You mean courtship," she said. "I believe I have been conducting it for 4 months," he said, "without the proper name for it." "You have," she said. "You have been conducting it quite effectively." "Good," he said, with the brevity that was its own form of eloquence. He walked her to the door of the house, and on the threshold he paused, and in the lamplight coming from inside, she could see his expression with more clarity than the starlight had allowed. And what was there was the same warmth she had been learning to read all summer, fully present and no longer managed. He leaned toward her and kissed her once, brief and certain, on the corner of her mouth. It was, she thought, the most characteristic thing he could possibly have done, not hesitant, not elaborate, but exactly sufficient for the moment. "Good night, Pauline," he said. "Good night, Wallace," she said, and she was smiling as she went inside, and she smiled at the wall again, and she did not even try to stop it. They were married in October of 1878. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell County quarterly, a cheerful, efficient man named Reverend Cole who had performed a considerable number of frontier marriages and had the practical attitude toward them that the frontier generally required. The ceremony was held at the ranch in the main yard on a Saturday morning when the mesquite had turned, and the fall air had that particular quality of clarity that Texas got in October. The crew was present, all of them, in their best available dress, which varied widely but which represented in each case the maximum effort the individual was capable of, and Pauline found this more touching than she could have anticipated. Domingo had spent 2 days preparing food. James and Thomas Wilcox had both come down from New Mexico for the occasion, which had required significant travel, and which told her something clear and good about the family she was marrying into. She had written to her 2 sisters in Biscuit County and her parents, and her younger sister Annette, the unmarried one who was the most adventurous of the family, had managed to make the trip, arriving the day before by stage with a carpet bag, and an expression of intense curiosity that she had directed at Wallace from the moment of introduction with a thoroughness Pauline found both embarrassing and entirely characteristic. Annette had pulled her aside in the kitchen on the morning of the wedding with the specific urgency of a person who had formed a conclusion and needed to deliver it. "He's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Pauline asked. "I don't know, someone older." "Someone more," she gestured vaguely. "Imposing." "He is imposing," Pauline said. "He's quiet," Annette said, "but it's not the usual kind of quiet. When he looks at you it's like he's reading something, and when he looks at you specifically," she paused for effect, "it's like the rest of the room has stopped existing." "Annette." "I am simply observing," Annette said with great dignity. "He will be very good to you, I can see that clearly. And you are glowing like a lantern, which I have never seen in you before, and I want you to know that I am absolutely delighted about it." Pauline hugged her sister. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything on earth," Annette said, and meant it. The ceremony was brief by some standards and precisely right by the standards of the people it served. Reverend Cole said the words, and Wallace and Pauline each said the words, and Wallace put a ring on her finger that she learned later he had ridden to the town of Lockhart to have made at the small jewelry shop there. A simple gold band with a very small detail worked into the inner surface that she would not see until she was at her mirror that evening. A small, delicate wheat stalk, the same shape as a biscuit grain. She had looked at it for a very long time in the lamplight, and then she had set the lamp down and gone to find her husband. The first years of their marriage had the quality of something being genuinely built, not just the maintenance of an existing structure, but the ongoing construction of something new. They learned each other in the way you only truly learn someone by living with them, in the unguarded morning hours and the exhausted late evenings, and the midday encounters that were not arranged but simply happened because they were moving through the same space. He was a consistent morning person. She was also a morning person, which suited them. He read more than she had expected, mostly practical literature, but also, she discovered, some fiction, which he kept on a shelf in the bedroom with a particular lack of display, as though the reading were a private thing he had not previously had occasion to share. She borrowed a book from the shelf one evening and he watched her do it and said nothing, but there was a quality to his attention that was quietly pleased. She maintained the books and expanded her role in the operation over the first 2 years, moving from pure bookkeeping into something closer to financial management, making recommendations on timing of sales and purchases that Wallace took seriously and considered carefully and sometimes accepted and sometimes declined with specific reasons that she always found well-reasoned. They worked together well. She had known they would. What she had not fully anticipated was how satisfying it would be to have a professional partner who was as focused and precise as she was, who treated her professional opinions as fully formed and worth engaging with. They had disagreements, occasionally sharp ones, because they were both people who had views and held them, and neither was inclined to manufacture agreement for the sake of peace. These disagreements were contained and resolved without residue, which she found was the most important thing. Nothing carried over into the next morning as unfinished business. They were both too practical for that. Their first child was a boy, born in the summer of 1880, a healthy and demanding baby who arrived during a thunderstorm at 4 in the morning, while the ranch doctor made his way from town and arrived approximately 40 minutes after the fact to find everything already well managed, which seemed to Pauline to be entirely predictable. They named him Robert James Wilcox, for Wallace's father and his oldest brother, and the combination of those two men in a single small person who had his father's eyes and what appeared to be his mother's particular quality of focused attention was something that both of them found alternately wonderful and humbling. Wallace held Robert with the careful precision of a man handling something valuable and irreplaceable, which was what the boy was, and the expression on his face during these early weeks was the most unguarded expression she had ever seen there. The management of his interior fully set aside by something that was simply too large and too important to manage. "You are going to be very good at this," she told him, on an evening when he was walking the baby through the bedroom in the lamplight with the slightly determined stride of a man who had found a task requiring his full effort. "I do not know that yet," he said. "I do," she said. He looked at her over the baby's head, and the expression there was the one she loved most, the one that said clearly and without words that she was the person he wanted to see looking back at him, and which she had been receiving for 2 years now, and which had not diminished in the slightest. Cole Jeffers, the young hand who had been notably involved in the matter of the supply run investigation, and who had, according to Wallace, been the most reliable participant in the Biscuit arrangement, was promoted to foreman when the previous man moved on in 1881. Pauline thought this was an excellent decision. Cole was 23, which made him young for the position, but he had the qualities required: reliable, fair, and honest without being rigid. She told Wallace this when he was discussing the decision with her one evening. He listened, considered, and said, "I had the same assessment." And then, after a pause, "I also feel I owe him something." "For the biscuits," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Among other things," he said. They had a second child in 1882, a girl they named Clara Me, and the operation continued to grow through the mid-1880s in ways that justified the financial planning they had done in the early years. Wallace expanded the cattle operation eastward on land he purchased in 1883, a significant acquisition that required the kind of careful financing that Pauline had been preparing for over the preceding 2 years. When the deal closed, she sat back from the accounts with a satisfaction that was very nearly physical. "Beautifully done," she told Wallace. "We built this together," he said, not as flattery but as fact, and she accepted it as fact because it was. The children grew in the way children grew, in the fast, irreversible way that nobody fully prepared you for. Robert was a serious child, focused and observant in ways his parents recognized, with an enormous appetite for practical knowledge and a particular love of the cattle operation that developed early and held steady. Clara was social and warm in a way that seemed to come from somewhere between the two of them and to exceed both, with a gift for managing the feelings in any room she was in that Pauline watched with genuine admiration. They added a third child in 1885, another boy they named Henry, and he arrived with the most personality of the three, an overwhelming cheerfulness and absolute fearlessness that kept both parents in a continuous mild state of anticipatory anxiety and kept Domingo and Cole Jeffers in a continuous state of amusement. Annette came to visit 3 times over the years and always left declaring the ranch and the life on it to be the most interesting thing she had encountered. And on the second visit she met Cole Jeffers, and on the third visit she had married him, which Pauline took a certain satisfaction in having neither predicted nor arranged, the outcome being better for having arrived entirely on its own merits. Cole and Annette settled in a small house on the edge of the Wilcox property, and the arrangement of having her sister close by, which she had not known she wanted until it happened, turned out to be one of the genuinely perfect accidents of her life. By 1888, a full decade after Pauline Monroe had stepped off the stage in Caldwell County with a carpet bag and a letter of employment, the Wilcox Cattle Company was running just over 5,000 head of Longhorn, employed 22 men, and maintained a financial record that any bank in southern Texas would have been happy to review. Pauline's books were the kind of books that told a complete and accurate story of the operation in clean, cross-referenced columns, and she looked at them sometimes with the particular satisfaction of something that had been constructed carefully over a long period, and that held its shape. She was sitting at her desk in the workroom one October evening, the same desk in the same room where she had sat on that first Saturday morning, when Wallace had come to stand in the doorway. The lamp was burning and the accounts were open in front of her, and the sounds of the evening were the comfortable sounds of the operation at the end of a working day. The children were in the kitchen with Domingo, who had become something considerably more than a cook to the household over the years, something closer to a fixed and beloved element of its fabric. Their voices were audible through the walls in a way that she had come to understand was one of the primary sounds of her life. She heard his step in the hallway. She knew it perfectly, the particular pace and weight of it after 10 years. He stopped in the doorway. "Still working," he said. "Almost done," she said. He came in and sat in the chair across the desk, the chair he had been sitting in for 10 years when they discussed the accounts, and leaned back in it with the slight loosening of posture that indicated the day's work was finished. "Good day?" she asked without looking up. "Good day," he said. "The fence repair on the east boundary is finished. Cole thinks the late grazing rotation in the south pasture is working better than expected." "Good," she said. She made a final notation and closed the ledger. I reconciled the third quarter against the projections this afternoon. And we are 11% ahead of projection, she said. He held her gaze across the desk with an expression that was the combination of things she had been reading for 10 years. The professional satisfaction and the warmth and the quality of attention that was specifically and entirely hers. Well done, he said. She corrected. He smiled, and after 10 years it was still a remarkable thing to see, the full version that she got privately and that remained in her private accounting, one of the great reserves of her wealth. Supper is almost ready, he said. Domingo is making biscuits, she laughed. He always said it the same way, without flourish, and it always landed the same way, a small private joke that had accumulated 10 years of meaning. Is he going to manage the last one properly? She asked. I believe the system is well established at this point, Wallace said. Cole and I have both given Cole Jr. extensive instruction on the matter. Cole Jr. was 8 years old and had recently been inducted into what he apparently considered the most important responsibility of his young life, the matter of the last biscuit, with an earnestness that had made both his parents and both his uncles laugh for a full minute. Extensive instruction, she repeated. Standards must be maintained, Wallace said. She came around the desk and he stood up as she did, because he always did, and they were standing quite close in the small room, close enough that she could see the gray that had come into his hair at the temples in the last few years, and which she thought suited him in the way that everything about the accumulated years had suited him, as evidence of a life built fully and well. I love you, she said, because she said it often and always meant it with the same full weight, and because he still had a particular expression when she said it that she suspected he never knew he made, a slight opening of the careful management that revealed how deeply those words landed in him every single time. I love you, he said, and held her face in both his hands the way he did when he was saying it with the fullest possible emphasis, and kissed her in the manner of a man who had known her for 10 years and had learned the subject thoroughly. Supper that evening was loud, the way supper with 3 children under the age of 8, and 2 of those being boys always was. Robert at 7 was absorbed in a conversation with Cole Jeffers about the fence repair. Clara at 6 was telling Annette about a drawing she had done. Henry at 3 was conducting an independent investigation of whether his entire biscuit could fit in his mouth at once, the results of which were not conclusive but were concerning. Pauline sat at the table and looked at the length of it, the faces of the people around it, the lamplight and the food and the noise and the warmth. And at the far end of the table Wallace was talking to James, who had made a rare visit from New Mexico and who was eating with the appetite of a man who had been on the trail for 3 days. And at the end of the biscuit dish's journey, when it reached Pauline's end of the table, there was 1 biscuit left. Cole Jr., who was seated next to her, looked at the biscuit in the dish with the full gravity of his assigned responsibility, and then looked at Pauline with the expression of a person who had been given something important to protect and intended to see it through. Aunt Pauline, he said with great seriousness, the last biscuit. She accepted it with the gravity the moment required. Thank you, Cole Jr., she said. He sat back in his chair with the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. She looked down the table. Wallace had stopped talking to James and was watching her with that expression, the one he never fully contained, the one that was all the 6 weeks of suppers and the Saturday morning in the workroom and the August night in the yard and the October ceremony and the 10 years of everything since, all of it held in a single, quiet, full look. She held up the biscuit slightly, a small private acknowledgement. He lifted his coffee cup in response, an equally small and private acknowledgement. Around them the table was magnificent chaos, all voices and motion, and the ordinary extraordinary fullness of a life built exactly as it was supposed to be built, on the accumulation of small, consistent, reliable, real things. She ate the biscuit. It tasted, as it always did, like everything. The November that followed Wallace's 42nd birthday brought the kind of quiet that descended on a ranch after the season's major work was done, a settling in, a drawing together. The cattle had been moved to their winter grazing. The books had been closed on another strong year. Annette and Cole were expecting their second child in the spring, and the household had the particular warmth that news of coming children always brought to it. Pauline found herself one afternoon walking the east boundary of the property with Wallace, the two of them having taken an hour away from their respective work for no reason better than it was a clear November afternoon, and the land was beautiful in the particular way it was beautiful in this season, the light coming in low and golden across the brush, and the far-off hills edged in pale blue. She had been thinking about something for several weeks, turning it over, examining it from the angles she examined everything from, and on this afternoon it felt like the right time. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her with the attention he always gave when she opened with that particular phrase. "When I arrived here," she said, "I was, in the honest accounting of it, a woman who had been managing a difficult situation for years by staying very controlled and very focused and keeping most of herself back from things, because staying back meant not being hurt by things. And I thought that was intelligence. I thought it was the right system." He was listening without filling the space. "You did not," she said, "try to take down that system. You just put a biscuit on my plate every evening and let me figure out what it meant in my own time. And when I did figure it out, you told me what you had to say with more honesty and directness than I had encountered from most people in my life. And then you kept being exactly who you were, which was the most remarkable thing, because most people are not who they appear to be over time, and you simply were." She paused. They had stopped walking and were standing in the long golden light with the mesquite around them and the sky enormous above. "I am telling you this," she said, "because I do not think I have said it exactly in this form. I have said I love you many times and I mean it more each time, but I want you to know specifically that you gave me back something I had managed away very carefully for a long time, the ability to trust that being fully present in something was safe. That is not a small thing. It is perhaps the largest thing." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking something incompletely before he responded to it. Then he said, "You gave me the same thing." She looked at him. "I was very good at running this operation," he said. "I was not, before you came here, particularly good at letting the operation be part of a larger life rather than the entire shape of one. You gave me back the understanding that the work was something you did in service of living, not instead of it. I did not know I had lost that until it came back." She took his hand, the same hand she had been holding for 10 years, and they stood in the November light on their land, on the land that was theirs together and had been built together and would be handed down to their children who were at this moment, in all probability, doing something that required supervision back at the house. "I suppose we should go back," she said. "Henry is probably trying to eat something inappropriate," he agreed. She laughed and he smiled, and they turned back toward the house, walking together in the long shadows of the late afternoon. In the spring of 1889, Robert turned 9 and developed a focused passion for keeping his own small ledger of the cattle he had personally identified in the South pasture, a project he conducted with such thoroughness that Pauline had to work very hard not to show how much she was moved by it. Clara turned 8 and had begun helping Domingo in the kitchen with such genuine interest and competence that he had begun, with evident pride, teaching her the specific techniques that made his biscuits the way they were. Henry turned 4 and was still primarily occupied with the investigation of everything that could be climbed, approached from the wrong direction, or otherwise tested. The spring also brought the 4th child, a girl they named Me Frances, who arrived with uncomplicated efficiency on a morning in April when the Texas wildflowers were at their fullest, and the yard was blooming with bluebonnets, and who was placed in her father's arms by the doctor while Pauline watched from the bed, with the particular exhausted and saturated contentment of a woman who had done something enormous and knew it. Wallace held the baby with the same careful precision he had brought to each of the others, and the expression on his face had accumulated over 4 children, a depth that was extraordinary to witness. 4, Pauline said. 4, he agreed. That is quite a number, she said. It is, he said. Are you satisfied? She asked. He looked at her over the baby's head, that look, the one that was all of it. I am the most satisfied man in Caldwell County, he said, with a simplicity that was more than enough. She smiled and let her eyes close for a moment, and the sounds of the ranch came through the open window. The cattle and the horses and the voices of the hands, and the distant sound of Robert and Clara, arguing about something with the passionate intensity of children who had inherited 2 parents incapable of not caring deeply about things. Henry was, by the sounds of it, in the kitchen with Domingo, who was apparently losing a negotiation involving the biscuit tin. The house was full of the ordinary, extraordinary sounds of a life built entirely right. Outside, the Texas spring pressed against the windows in light and warmth and the impossible blue sky of the hill country. And Pauline Monroe, who was Pauline Wilcox now, who had arrived with a carpet bag and a letter of employment and a carefully managed interior that had been quietly and thoroughly opened by a man who thought that making sure she ate was the only thing he had the standing to do at the time, lay in the morning light with her 4th child newly arrived, and her husband beside her and her 3 other children alive and loud and entirely themselves in the rooms of the house they had built together. And she thought about the biscuit, the small gold ring, the August stars, the October ceremony, the 6 weeks of suppers and everything after, and she thought, this is what it is to be fully in something. This is what it is to have stayed. She had been right 10 years ago on a November afternoon on the east boundary about what he had given her back. She had also been wrong about one thing. She had said it was perhaps the largest thing. She looked at Wallace, who was still holding the baby, who had the amber-brown eyes of the Wilcox family and already an expression of focused assessment that was going to cause her parents significant amounts of complicated emotion over the coming decades. It was not perhaps the largest thing. It was simply the thing. The one that everything else was made of. Wallace, she said. Yes, he said. The last biscuit is hers, she said, when she's old enough. He looked from the baby to his wife, and the corner of his mouth moved, and it moved all the way, the full, rare, beautiful smile. Obviously, he said. And outside in the kitchen, as though on cue, there was the sound of Henry succeeding in whatever negotiation he had been conducting with Domingo, and then Clara's voice announcing supper would be in an hour, and then Robert's voice citing some statistical fact about cattle that no one had asked for, and then Domingo's voice rising above all of it with the particular warmth of a man who had been in this house for 19 years and intended to be in it for 19 more. The sounds of their life. The sounds of everything they had built on the foundation of small, consistent, reliable, real things. The last biscuit passed down the long table without making it a thing, because some things were too important to make into a production, because some things said everything precisely because they said nothing, because sometimes the most honest expression of love was the one that showed up every day in the same small form, quiet and certain and completely enough. Everything was enough. Everything was more than enough. It was everything.